or continue to focus on King Hezekiah of Judah. This is our 10th class. We have 3 more classes to kind of wrap up this study. So the next 2 classes will be taken up with the next 3 kings, and then we'll kind of conclude with the next 2 classes, the next 3 kings, and then 1 additional one. It's probably late in the study. If you've got a comment or anything to make in class and I don't call on you, just shout something out, because I might have overlooked some folks last Wednesday and I just flat didn't see you. So if Mike's got to raise your hand so I can see, so real loud. So last week we began to look at King Hezekiah, and the thing that we principally focused on is it seems as soon as Hezekiah initiated his sole reign, he tried to reform the worship of Judah. He tried to draw their attention back to the Lord. The very first thing we kind of noted in 2 Chronicles chapter 29 and verse 3 is almost this dating, almost like the very first thing that he did. He wanted to draw people's hearts back to God. And you kind of wonder about that. Maybe during the reign, his co-regency with his father Ahaz, and he began to read the book of the law or be influenced by Isaiah or Micah or someone of that ilk, he would then push, as soon as he became king, to try to restore worship to God. And as a result of that, the next stage that we're going to look at, because he sought the Lord blessed him. Because when we look in 2 Kings chapter 18 and verses 7 and 8, it says this, "And the Lord was with him. Wherever he went, he was successful." He was successful in his rebellion against the Assyrian forces, those forces that had later taken the northern tribes away. He was successful in overcoming the Philistines, even going as far as Gaza, taking over that land. Because he chose to seek the Lord blessed him. Now, as the story of 2 Kings kind of lays itself out, that's what we're kind of introduced with his reign by. But then it goes back in verses 9 through 12 and kind of repeats something. I want us to go and read that really quickly. It says, "Now in the 4th year of King Hezekiah, which was in the 7th year of Hoshea, son of Elah, king of Israel, Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up against Samaria and besieged it. At the end of 3 years, they captured it. In the 6th year of King Hezekiah, which was the 9th year of Hoshea, king of Israel, Samaria was captured. Then the king of Assyria carried Israel away into exile to Assyria and put them in Halah and Habor and on the river Gozan and the cities of the Medes. Because they did not obey the voice of the Lord their God, but transgressed his covenant, even all that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded, they would neither listen nor do it." And as the writer of Kings tells this story of King Hezekiah, he reintroduces something that he'd already talked about back in chapter 17. He'd already told that story. And so the question is why is it important for us to be reminded of these things during the reign of King Hezekiah? I want to give you some suggestions. I think one of the reasons he chose to remind us of what the Assyrian did to Hoshea and the tribes of the north was to make sure that we are acknowledged that Hezekiah was aware of this. He knew the threat that Assyria posed. He knows what they can do. And that seems to maybe motivate some of his choices that we're going to see in just a few moments when Sennacherib chooses to invade Judah. But another reason that I think this is in the text is just to remind us of the true reason Israel fell. It wasn't because Assyria was so strong and mighty. They were. It wasn't because they were superior in arms or armament. They were. The reason they fell is because they had chosen to disobey the Lord and not follow the commandments that Moses had set out. And so as you think about that in contrast with King Hezekiah's reign, is there any wonder that God is preserving Judah? Because you had people like Hezekiah trying to get the people to obey the Lord. So it's just reminding us where we are in history and why Judah is still being preserved at this point. But it said that Hezekiah was in rebellion to Assyria. And it seems like Assyria doesn't really take that seriously until really to about 701 BC, and Sennacherib gets fed up and he invades Judah. The fact of the matter is, in 2 Kings chapter 18 and verse 13, he comes against Judah and takes all the fortified cities of Judah and seizes them. So Assyria starts taking this rebellion of Hezekiah and Judah seriously. They come and exert their forces and take all these fortified cities. What is Hezekiah's response? How does he respond to this threat, this sign of aggression? How does he respond? Well, the 2 Kings points out he bribes them, right? He says, oh, what should I do, or how have I wronged you? And what does the Assyrian king say? He says, I would like 300 talents of silver and 30 talents of gold. Where did Hezekiah get the money from? Isn't that kind of odd? I mean, he had spent at least a period of his reign, 40 plus years, restoring the temple and trying to reestablish the tithe. But he stripped the gold from the doors, and he stripped the gold overlay from other places. He robbed the treasury of the king's house and of the Lord's house. And he used that to try to buy off Sennacherib. But is that all he did? The fact of the matter is we look over at 2 Chronicles. In 2 Chronicles chapter 32, he not only tried to buy off Sennacherib, but he also prepared for the fact that Sennacherib might not be bought off. So he had all the outside water sources kind of cut off. He built up the walls of the city. He's kind of hedging his bets. I mean, he tried to buy or try to appease Sennacherib with a monetary gift, but at the same time, he was preparing for the fact that Sennacherib wouldn't be appeased. Well, Sennacherib wasn't. And he sent a delegation along with an army to Jerusalem. And as we get there, we see this delegation from Sennacherib come, and we see a delegation sent from Hezekiah grow to meet them. And we have two speeches in the book of 2 Kings. The first speech goes from verse 19 down through verse 25 from this fellow by the Bible just simply identifies as Rabshakeh, and we don't know if that's his name or his position. Some people suggest that means field commander, so that just might mean he's a general. But he comes and he makes this speech before the people of God. And you know what he tells them right off the bat? They shouldn't trust in Egypt. Egypt's untrustworthy. They'll lean on them and they'll break like a staff and pierce their hand. Furthermore, he goes on and says, you can't depend upon the Lord either because he's angry with you. Because you know what your king did? He went through and tore down all these different places of worship and limited God to worship in one place. Now you think about those two statements that he makes to the people of God, and I find them interesting. The first one's true. He's repeating the words of Isaiah, the warnings that Isaiah, never put your trust in Egypt or princes. But they meant it for two different reasons. Isaiah was trying to give them that warning so they would put their trust in the Lord. Rabshakeh or Assyria was making that warning so they would be disheartened or disillusioned and say, you can't trust in anybody. But the second one I find really interesting. I think that was probably a ploy that would work when Assyria would go against other Canaanite or other polytheistic cultures. But I don't think it has much weight against a culture that has a monotheistic worldview. Because really, what he's kind of getting at, if you reduce the number of places of worship throughout a land, somehow the God is either angry or he grows weaker. But that's not true in Judaism. God had given them a place to worship. Actually, Hezekiah did exist as right. So he begins by trying to discredit Hezekiah and try to warn them where they shouldn't put their trust. Then he offers them a carrot. He tries to buy them off. I mean, what's he say? Look at, if you will, down in the text. He goes on and says in verse 23, now therefore come make a bargain with my master, the king of Assyria, and I will give you 2,000 horses if you're able to put on your part to set riders on them. So He threatens them. Then he tries to offer them the carrot. And then his final argument is, well, you know, the Lord's with us. The Lord had told us to come up. And so that's his first speech. And he makes this speech to this delegation that Hezekiah comes out to meet them. How does the delegation respond to that? How do they react to this? What is their suggestion or seemingly the implication that Rabshakeh is going to do next? They make a request.
They asked him not to talk in Hebrew or Aramaic. They don't want the people on the wall to understand what he's saying.
It seems like Rabshakeh is either turning his attention away from the officials and going to turn them to the populace of the city of Jerusalem. And they make a request. Continue to speak with us in Judean or Hebrew and continue to speak with us in Aramaic and don't speak in Hebrew because we don't want the people to understand. But that's not what Rabshakeh does. He goes on and addresses the people. And this seems to be a ploy, at least from most historical sources that we can get. One of the ways that Assyria would go and capture a nation is they would try to establish rapport with the working class, if you will. Okay? Hey, look, these princes, they're all setting up in their mighty fine houses. They're not serving you, they're serving themselves. We're like you. We're working class, we're warriors. And they tried to establish a sense of rapport with the citizens of Jerusalem. And then they go on to start denouncing Hezekiah in every way that they can. 4 different times in this text, he talks about denouncing Hezekiah. He denounces him, don't let Hezekiah deceive you in verse 21, because he can't deliver you. Verse 30, don't let Hezekiah make you trust in the Lord, because he can't deliver you. Verse 31, don't listen to Hezekiah. And he continues on because he seems like we're going to promise you something Hezekiah can't deliver. We're going to give you a new promised land. We're going to give you the land that he can't. Now, I just want us to look at these 2 speeches. We've got, every culture and every period of time kind of has this mindset that we're always smarter, we've always figured out more than people that have gone on before us. But this type of propaganda campaign, it's been going on for a long time. And these same ways are the way people try to manipulate people today, politically or any way else. That is what the king of Assyria is trying to do. He's trying to dishearten them. He's trying to disillusion them. He's trying to establish rapport. When threats don't work, he offers money. He makes promises that are grand and really unbelievable unless you're just trying to grasp onto something without reasoning it through. That's what he offers them. But how did the people react to his speeches? I mean, did they go, yeah? How do they react? Yeah. And I find that striking. I mean, it says in the text that they were commanded. In verse 36, but the people were silent and answered him not a word, for the king's commandment was, do not answer him. Now, you could say, well, this is Hezekiah's idea, and it was because it was a commandment, but the people could have answered anyway. They chose to follow the king's commandment. And I think in some ways that's a really unusual response and maybe very telling to us, because when people taunt and when people bluster, when they try to make these threats, sometimes silence is the best answer. This quote I ran across I thought was kind of good. It just said this. It says, silence is our best reply to the allegation and taunts of our foes. Be still, O persecuted soul. Hand over thy cause to God. It's useless to argue, even in many cases to give explanations. Be still and commit thy cause to God. I mean, they were going to get it anywhere arguing with Rabshakeh. He had an agenda he wanted to accomplish. And the best thing they could do is just remain silent. How does Hezekiah respond? So the people were silent, but what does Hezekiah do?
That's two things. One, he consults Isaiah, the spokesman for God. And secondly, he takes it into the temple and spreads it before God in prayer.
Great point. And right away, though, Matt.
But even before that, his reaction is one of despair. He tears his clothes. He hears what's going on, hears of it, and he shows despair in himself.
Okay. I mean, he tears his clothes, he rents his garment, extreme grief, maybe even a sense of repentance before God for his earlier actions or interactions with Sennacherib. And then, as Gary points out, he sends people to seek out Isaiah and seeks a word from Isaiah and then eventually takes it to the Lord. First of all, I want you to see how refreshing a response this is. I mean, we've been studying the kings of Israel. Did we see any kings of Israel go do that when they got in trouble? No. And very few kings of Judah do we see that. This type of humility and realization that they're totally dependent upon God. I'm just going to tell you, I don't think Hezekiah is perfect. And the fact is we've already seen some chinks in his armor, but in some ways, this is the epitome of King David. Someone who is humble enough to admit his wrongs and approach God. I think that is truly what it means to be a man after God's own heart. Not that he was perfect, but that he was willing to humble himself. And that's what we see him do. And maybe he goes to Isaiah, and here's what Isaiah promises him. He says, "Behold, I'm going to put a spirit in him," that is Sennacherib, "so that he will hear news and return to his own land. And I will make him fall by the sword in his own land." And so Isaiah speaks this word of the Lord, and how many verses later? 2? 3? 3 verses later, this begins to come true. Because Rabshakeh, he goes and wants to relay this information to King Sennacherib. And he's not in Lachish anymore, but he had gone down to Libnah, so he had to travel further on down to Libnah. And while he went to Libnah, he left the army that besieged Jerusalem and left them there, but he was coming and giving this report to Sennacherib and probably gaining further instruction. And when he got down to Sennacherib, Sennacherib begins to hear a rumor. And the rumor is that the king of Cush, or Egypt, is going to pose a threat. Now, I'm just going to tell you, on the world stage at this time, the only nation that had any chance against Assyria would probably still be Egypt. And they're not a real serious threat, but there was a threat that could actually inflict some harm. And because he heard that rumor, Sennacherib didn't go along with the rest of his army up to Jerusalem. God's word through Isaiah came true almost immediately, the first part. And so he was distracted and couldn't go up and wage war, but you know what he did? He sent another threatening letter. He sent another threat by the hand of a messenger. And he says this in verse 10, "You shall say to King Hezekiah, king of Judah, do not let your God in whom you trust deceive you, saying, Jerusalem will not be given into the hand of the king of Assyria." Again, casting doubt on God and saying, do not put your trust in God. And that's where we see, I think, one of the beautiful pictures in all the Old Testament, but especially in King Hezekiah's life. We see this in verse 14. "Then Hezekiah took the letter from the hand of messengers and read it. And he went up to the house of the Lord, and he spread it before the Lord." Now, I think in some senses that may be very much literal. It's as if he took the letter and spread the scroll out before God, as if God would read it. But I think there is also a figurative sense that's being used in. And what do you think it might mean? What does it say to you when King Hezekiah spread this before the Lord?
He was admitting in some ways that there's nothing he can do by himself.
Yeah. I mean, that seems to be the figurative sense. He's entrusting himself to God. God, you take note of this threat. God, you take note of this judgment. Does this remind you of any verses in the New Testament? Well, Daniel just read from Philippians. Think of any verses in Philippians this sounds a lot like? Look over at Philippians chapter 4. I mean, isn't that exactly what Paul tells us to do in verses 6 and 7? Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses all comprehension, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. Exactly what King Hezekiah did. He came and laid this before the Lord. And he utters this great prayer where almost the prayer goes point by point to refute the things that Rabshakeh claimed about God. I mean, he starts with kind of acknowledging who God is. He says this, he says, pray before the Lord, verse 15, O Lord, the God of Israel, who are enthroned above the cherubim, you are the God, you alone of all the kingdoms of the earth, you have made heaven and earth. I mean, he was not just the God of Judah, was he? He was God over all the kingdoms of the earth. And so he acknowledges that. And then he begins to lay out the problem, what Sennacherib had done. Not only was he threatening Judah, he had diminished or demeaned Jehovah. And then he lays his petition out. Look at verse 19. He says, Now, O Lord our God, I pray, deliver us from his hand, that all the kingdoms of the earth may know that you alone, O Lord, are God. So that's his petition. I mean, he doesn't bandy around. He doesn't try to couch this in language that doesn't admit his fault. He said, deliver us. Help us. Not only for our sake, but for the glory of your own name. That is the petition that he lays out before Hezekiah. So before we go any further, any thoughts down through this text? We kind of went through it, but I want to look at Isaiah's response to this in a little more detail. Matt?
There's so much that's unsaid here. Sennacherib basically reaches an agreement with Hezekiah to not siege Jerusalem if he pays this bounty, which Hezekiah pays by stripping the temple. Sennacherib reneges that. And, I keep thinking about the Lord used Babylon, uses Assyria, he uses them to punish his people for their sin. And I just wonder if it was the Lord's intention, because obviously Sennacherib, the Assyrians have already taken many of the fortified cities of Judah. This is, I believe, the will of God at work. And Hezekiah finally, it seems to be, should have gone to the Lord right from the start, didn't do so, stripped the temple of its gold. So I don't know if we're to indict him to some degree for attempting to solve this problem on his own. And was it the Lord's intention for Sennacherib to take Jerusalem, but because of Hezekiah's prayer, he relented for a time?
So the first part of that, I think we have a repeating pattern, because we're going to see this later on when the emissary from Babylon comes. In the chronicler, he writes that was a test from the Lord. I can't help but think that this was a test too. So I think there is a parallel there in how the Lord is using this, and we'll kind of look at that a little bit more. The second part, it could be very likely. I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's very likely in the text. So, but the Lord does say when the emissary from Babylon comes, it is a test for Hezekiah's heart, whether he is true to the Lord. He's using that opportunity to see if Hezekiah was truly dependent upon God.
And I think that the lesson is, be careful about with whom you make deals. There's the devil and Daniel Webster in literature about striking deals with minions of Satan or Satan himself. This is an object lesson, no. Rely upon God. And ultimately, that's what Hezekiah does.
Absolutely. And I mean, we've been taught that lesson. I think that's one of the great lessons of King. We go back to Jehoshaphat, who in many respects was worthy of our emulation, except he was naive and kept making bad deals. And I mean, that over and over again, putting himself in harm's way, and it harmed himself and descendants after him. But that's a great point, Matt. Anybody else? Okay, let's just read this together. So let's pick up the reading in 2 Kings chapter 19. And I want to read through verse 20 through the end of the chapter and just make a few comments on this text together. And it says there, "Then Isaiah the son of Amos sent to Hezekiah, saying, Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, because you have prayed to me about Sennacherib, king of Assyria, I have heard you." And that one verse, in verse 20, goes to support the idea that Matt had put forth. It was because of his prayer, because he prayed, because he humbled himself, because he sought the Lord. He says in verse 21, "This is the word that the Lord has spoken against him. She has despised you and mocked you, the virgin daughter of Zion. She has shaken her head behind you, the daughter of Jerusalem. Whom have you reproached and blasphemed? Against whom have you raised your voice and haughtily lifted up your eyes? Against the Holy One of Israel." I want you to understand the language that he's talking about. First of all, he calls Jerusalem this virgin daughter, this daughter that has not been despoiled. She had not been conquered. And when Assyria tried to lift up themselves, who were they really lifting themselves up against? They weren't lifting themselves up against Jerusalem. They were lifting themselves up against Jerusalem's protector, the one who had charge over Jerusalem. That's who they're lifting themselves up against. And notice what it says in verse 20. "Through your messengers you have reproached the Lord. And you have said, with many chariots, I come up to the heights of the mountains, to the remotest parts of Lebanon. And I cut down its tall cedars and its choicest cypresses. And I entered its farthest lodging place, its thickest forest. I dug wells and drank foreign waters. And with the sole of my feet I dried up all the rivers of Egypt. Have you not heard? Long ago I did it. From ancient times I planned it. Now I have brought it to pass that you should turn fortified cities into ruinous heaps." So notice what's being said here. Assyria is making these claims, these boasts about their accomplishments. Look at what I've done. And the Lord said, the only reason you're doing it is because of me. The only reason, Assyria, that you have grown in power, the only reason, Assyria, that you have been victorious is because of me. So you can't brag. You can't boast in yourself. He says in verse 26, "Therefore their inhabitants were short of strength, and they were dismayed and put to shame. They were as the vegetation of the field and as the green herb, as the grass on the housetop is scorched before it's grown up. But I know you're sitting down, and you're going out, and you're coming in, and you're raging against me. Because of your raging against me, and because of your arrogance, has come up to my ears. Therefore I will put my hook in your nose and my bridle in your lips, and I will turn you back by the way you come." Did you notice verse 28, how the Lord describes his dealings with them? He's going to put the bridle in the bit. When we read in Amos chapter 4, that's one of the favorite tactics of the Assyrians, how they inflicted torture upon the people that they conquered. The Lord says, I'm going to recompense. I'm going to lead you forth as the way you led others forth. And he says, "And this shall be the sign for you. You will eat this year what grows of itself, and in the second year what springs from the same. In the third year you sow, reap, plant vineyards, and eat their fruit. The surviving remnant of the house of Judah will again take root downward and bear fruit upward. For out of Jerusalem will go forth a remnant, and out of Mount Zion survivors. The zeal of the Lord will perform this. Therefore, thus says the Lord concerning the king of Assyria, he will not come to this city or shoot an arrow there. He will not come before it with a shield or throw up a siege ramp against it. By the way that he came, by the same way he will return, and he shall not come to this city, declares the Lord. For I will defend this city to save it for my own sake and for the sake of my servant David." So he gives them a sign, and the sign is in the third year, you're going to have abundance. The first 2 years, you're just going to basically have a normal harvest, but in the third year, you will have a have an abundant harvest. And not only that, the king of Assyria, he will not harm a hair on the head of the inhabitants of this city or the city itself. The Lord has decreed it. And he does so for two reasons, at least here in the end of this text. One, for his sake, and secondly, for the sake of his servant David. So how does the Lord accomplish this? How does he make this come true so Sennacherib and his army doesn't besiege Jerusalem? What does he do? Yeah, the favorite part of the story of Hezekiah. In a single night, an angel of the Lord strikes down 185,000 soldiers. Now, I don't know about you. How do you explain that? How are you going to spin that back home in Assyria? Well, I'll tell you, one of the rumors that grew up from that is quoted by Herodotus, and he quotes from an Egyptian source. It says that a plague of rats and mice came out and chewed through the bowstrings and the sandal straps and the shield straps, and because all of their weapons were damaged, they had to just leave suddenly in the night. So that's how they kind of explained it. But the inspired record says that in a single night, 185,000 were struck down. And the army had to flee back home. Bob?
There is an uninspired record of this when the Assyrians, Sennacherib's prison, talking about bragging. Sennacherib said, I shut up Hezekiah like a bird in a cage.
Yeah.
That's his perspective.
So when he comes back, he's got to spin it. And what Bob was referring to is an artifact called the Taylor Prism. And one of the famous quotes is what Bob just mentioned. He said, Hezekiah himself, I locked up in Jerusalem like a bird in it. I'm just pretending it didn't happen. I set out to accomplish what I wanted to do. It don't matter that my troops are 185,000 short. Look what I accomplished. And so he just ignored what transpired that night and bragged about his accomplishments. Now, so God fulfilled his promise. First of all, Sennacherib didn't come up to Jerusalem. Secondly, he destroyed his army. But then he took Sennacherib's life. It seems like Sennacherib passed over some older sons in favor of a younger son by the name of, as we read, if you'll look over in 2 Kings chapter 19, Esarhaddon. And so his two older sons then killed him in the night. So Sennacherib never again became a threat to Judah. So the Lord fulfilled his promise to the people. So, anybody down through this section before we look at chapter 20 about Hezekiah? Okay. So chapter 20 kind of moves on, and we find as chapter 20 begins that Hezekiah is mortally ill. He's ill to the point of death. Anybody got any idea how old Hezekiah is now when this happens? I'll just tell you, if the numbers are correct here, he is roughly 39 years old. Okay? And we know that, so we go back to chapter 18. It says he was 25 when he took reign, and he was 29. He ruled in Jerusalem. God grants him 15 more years, so you take 15 from 29, 14 plus 25, and you get kind of 39 years old. So I want you to just understand, it's not only that he was mortally ill, he was also a pretty young man. I mean, he was a young man comparatively, and he turns his back to the wall and cries out to God. Again, the Lord hears his plea and turns back, gives him a sign to turn back the shadow on the clock. A really kind of an appropriate sign, if you will, for what's going to transpire. Now, I want to just kind of look at this real quickly, his prayer here in verse 5 of chapter 20, where God's response. He says, I have heard your prayer, I have seen your tears. Behold, I will heal you. On the third day you shall go up to the house of the Lord. I think it's a really telling response from the Lord. Because he not only hears Hezekiah's prayer, he sees his tears. And what I mean, he understands this is not just, idle rambling. This is not just a false promise, Hezekiah, but this is someone who is moved deeply about his future, and the Lord sees his humility and his sorrow and his fear, and he responds to it. And he sends Isaiah to him, and he gives him an additional 15 years on his life. He will continue to defend the city. And then you have this odd statement that he takes a cake of figs and places on the boil, and thus Hezekiah becomes healed. So that's what transpires in chapter 20. And you think from that point on, everything's great. But then we have the episode with Merodach, Baladan of Babylon. This official comes from Babylon to meet with King Hezekiah, and putting together the different references, seems like this guy came for three potential different reasons. One, according to Josephus, he wanted to form an alliance with Judah to stand against Assyria and overthrow them. The second reason, if you look over in the book of 2 Chronicles, he wanted to find out about the miracle, how Sennacherib's army was sent away. And then third, he used as a guise Hezekiah's illness as a way to come and express his concern. So all three of those are kind of mentioned in the text, why this man, Merodach Baladan, came. So he came. How did Hezekiah greet him? What did he do with this emissary from Babylon?
Showed him all the wealth.
Yeah. So what's the big deal about that?
Well, I don't think it's a very wise idea to show emissaries from a hostile nation the great wealth that you possess.
Yeah. Just reading the text of 2 Kings, you kind of scratch your head. Like Matt says, it's just not wise. I mean, you don't want to just kind of do everything. But when we go to read 2 Chronicles, we get a little more detail. Turn over to 2 Chronicles chapter 32 and first look at verse 31. Because it's there that we're found out that this is a test sent from the Lord. It says, even in the matters of the envoys of the rulers of Babylon, who sent to him to acquire the wonder that had happened in the land, God left him alone only to test him, that he might know that all that was in his heart. For Hezekiah, this official, this emissary from Babylon, was meant to be a test. It was seen as a test by God to try to reveal what was in Hezekiah's heart. Well, his response revealed what was in his heart at this moment. Back up to verse 24. In those days, Hezekiah became mortally ill. He prayed to the Lord, and the Lord spoke to him and gave him a sign. But Hezekiah gave no return for the benefit he received, because his heart was proud. Therefore, wrath came upon him and on Judah and Jerusalem. However, Hezekiah humbled the pride of his heart, both he and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that the wrath of the Lord did not come upon them in the days of Hezekiah. So the problem seems to be putting those two accounts together. It wasn't merely showing this emissary from Babylon his wealth and all the blessings that he's had. It seemed twofold. One, he didn't adequately express his thanks to God after God delivered them, but it almost seems like it's almost a Nebuchadnezzar kind of moment. He was going in and showing all this treasure and say, look at everything I've done, instead of everything that God had done for him or on his behalf. His pride of heart. That seems to be what kind of drove him. So it was a test, and at this moment in time, this very moment, it was a failure on King Hezekiah's part. Now, but he relents. As we kind of read through the text there, it says in verse 19, I want to get everybody's thoughts here. So after God relents, but he says, because you have done this in verses 17 and 18, here's the consequence. Behold, the days are coming when all that is in your house and all that your fathers are laid up in store, so this day will be carried to Babylon, and nothing shall be left, says the Lord. Some of your sons who shall issue from you, whom you will beget, will be taken away, and they will become officials in the palace of the king of Babylon. Looking ahead to the days of Daniel and Mishael and Hananiah and Azariah and others, So because you have done these things, these are consequences. But I will not do it in your days. How would you judge Hezekiah's response in verse 19? Here's how Hezekiah responds to Isaiah. The word of the Lord which you have spoken is good. For he thought, is it not so, if there will be peace and truth in my days? How do you take that?
Well, he's been raked over the coals for this kind of fatalistic future where his own children are themselves going to be the victims of this. And it just makes you wonder about why doesn't he think more about the people that will come after him, his own children, in this pronouncement. It should have devastated him, but it didn't.
Yeah.
Now, I don't know, it's hard again, we have limited information here to know exactly what was in his heart. But he certainly is not a perfect man.
No. So I'm going to offer just three, and I'm just going to tell you, I don't know. I mean, it could be like, it is just basically a selfish response. Well, good. At least it's not my day. That seems very hard to me because the Lord's wrath turned against him. I lean against that response. Secondly, he was just thankful for the period of relief that he did have. Like, I understand this judgment's from the Lord. I'm thankful at least it's going to be generations ahead. The third, this could in some ways be like, thy will be done. That's why it's good. This is a just response. There may be other suggestions, but at least one of those three. I kind of lean against the first one because if his attitude was that selfish and self-centered, I don't know if the Lord would have turned away. Maybe he would have. But those are at least a couple of responses there to the text. So we end his life there. He lays down by his fathers. He is honored by the people. Kind of the last act, it's really strange. So you have this wicked Ahab. You have Hezekiah, who seems to show as a brining light, but his son returns to the pattern of his grandfather. So you have this one kind of brief moment in Judah. Jim?
To the last point you made on him, the NET version says the Lord's word which you have announced is appropriate.
Okay. So the translators kind of take
Mean the same way.
thy will be done. Yeah. So I want to leave us with one application, and it goes back to the very first speech of the king of Assyria, his emissary. And he asked this question, what is this confidence you have? Kind of taunting the people of God. And I think it's a really interesting question, and it's an interesting question for us. And I ran across this quote that I think is kind of just very insightful. He says, our life must to a large extent be a mystery. Our peace pass understanding and our motives be hidden. The sources of our supply, the ground of our confidence, the reasons for our actions must evade the most searching scrutiny of those who stand outside the charmed circle of the face of God. We must be prepared to be criticized because of our behavior as discerned by facts which the princes of this world know not. And while Rabshakeh meant that as a question that derided the people and to cause them to cast doubts on their trust in God, the fact of the matter is it must appear very confusing to people who do not know God for the peace that people exist, or the joy that they have, or the graciousness that they show, or the love that they have for one another. Because unless you know God, those things are largely a mystery. And I think that's a very challenging or thought-provoking quote for us. Anybody else? Matt?
And that assertion could be made as well about Daniel, about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego.
Yeah.
Frequently we see people around God's people completely puzzled by those who are showing faith in God.
It's just totally foreign to them, and they don't understand it. It's not physically or carnally appraised. Yeah. That's.
People are puzzled at our behavior or seeking God and not following the culture of the day.
It's 1 Corinthians 1 and 2. The preaching of the cross is foolishness. And God makes... So thank you all. That's it tonight. And Lord willing, we'll pick up. I'll send questions on Monday, and we'll join back together and finish our study together. Thanks.